Hello and welcome to 21st Century Vitalism. This is a podcast exploring how we can best maintain a sense of energy, inspiration, and wakefulness while living with the unique challenges of the modern age. My name is Brett Kane, and I'll be your host on this journey as we have a multidisciplinary conversation with a wide variety of speakers representing a broad spectrum of practices and backgrounds. The idea is to provide as many keys to as many locks as possible, whether it's through spirituality, somatic practice, art making, environmentalism, or martial arts. Each of these episodes represents a pathway through the uncertainty of our precious and fragile world. In this episode, we're joined by the co-founder of the Good Grief Network, LaUra Schmidt. In it, we discuss their work spreading awareness on how we can best tend to our grief that comes from acknowledging the impending climate catastrophes that we're facing as a global community. LaUra has also written a book on the same subject called How to Live in a Chaotic Climate, in which they detail the 10 steps to resilience and empowerment in a chaotic climate program, which will be the focus of this episode. So whether you're actively contemplating the state of the world through the lens of climate change or not, I feel that this conversation is wholly important for every person living on Earth to take into their system. LaUra's heartfelt exploration resonates very strongly with the core themes of this show, and when it's applied to our lives, really has the potential to greatly open our hearts to ourselves and those we share this planet with. There's also a strong emphasis placed on the role of embodiment and somatic practice as a means to provide resources for our grief work, which, if you've been listening to this show for a while, you know that I absolutely adore. So if this work feels pertinent to you, I highly encourage you to give LaUra's platform a look, whether it's through their book, How to Live in a Chaotic Climate, or their virtual cohorts through the Good Grief Network. It's an intuitive program that can help give you the tools to navigate the uncertainties of our world and connect with others who have some of the same concerns. The links for that will be down below. If you want to support this show, consider heading on over to patreon.com/21stcenturyvitalism to become a supporter. Any amount of help really allows me to keep the lights on and this show rolling forward. Though I do understand if finances are tight, that's totally okay. And I would point you in the direction of subscribing over on YouTube, following us on Instagram, or even liking us on Facebook. If you really, really want to support this platform, I'd ask that you employ some of these practices into your life and then write to me about your experience. I'd love to hear from you and truly do make this show for you to have the resources available to work through whatever challenging situation it is that you may be facing. So with all of that said, I'd like you to sit back, maybe drink some tea, do some stretches, but most importantly, open your heart for LaUra Schmidt. Okay, so the cameras are rolling. So I just want to start by saying hello, LaUra. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time. How are we doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Thanks for inviting me, Brett. Happy to be here.
Yeah, of course. I was just telling you before we started recording just that I really love what you're doing with your platform. I think the work with the Good Grief Network is so, so important, and a space to be able to talk about what you're calling eco distress, I think is just vital right now. Not to have a pun with my show title, but so, for the people who've never heard of you or the work that you're doing, could you describe a little bit about your inspiration for the Good Grief Network and what you're hoping to achieve with that?
Definitely. We aim to bring people together to have the conversations that are not quite conventionally socially acceptable to have, and then face the hard realities of our time. But with that comes some amount of emotional distress. If we come to an understanding of how intricately gridlocked our systems are and how our systems are creating lots of injustices to different levels all around the world. Uh, it, of course, will bring up things like despair and hopelessness and grief and fear, and which is why we prefer the term eco distress or collective distress as opposed to something like just grief flat out or anxiety. There's a whole range of emotional feelings or emotional reactions rather that we start to feel when we wake up to the severity of the predicament, and then from that place, once we start learning how to be with these hard and heavy emotions, where might we go? What might we feel?
So, what about how did your life lead you to this kind of work? There's so many paths that are much less stressful for people to take. For you to go directly into the belly of the beast, so to speak, what was it that brought you to this?
I majored in environmental studies and biology as an undergrad and was trained as a scientist, really wanted to go into conservation biology, really wanted to protect animals, and realized that what was happening on Earth with ecocide in the climate disaster was actually happening now and not projected in the future, and that these impacts were so much bigger than anyone was creating space to talk about, so much bigger than our politicians were actually willing to admit and take action on. And that plummeted me into feelings of isolation, feelings of despair. And a lot of my peers or family members couldn't relate. And that exacerbated the feelings of isolation. And I realized, one, if I wanted to be a change maker, if I saw these problems and I actually wanted to figure out ways to make the world a better place, I needed to have some resilient strategies myself, but also I needed to have the support of community members who also saw the problem as being quite severe so that I could feel connected, I could feel inspired, I could see how other people are coping with the state of the world and still committed to change making. And so bridged a lot of these gaps, I think, in our social norms and just said, we need spaces to talk about this. We need spaces to come together. We need spaces to feel and then see what's on the other side of that. And so the inspiration really comes from, like, I love the image of the belly of the beast is like I suffered for so long with my own feelings of overwhelm that I feel like I can give a gift to the world and to the people who are feeling this so that they might not feel as isolated and may not feel as alone and can actually build up some resilient strategies to face the tumult that is ongoing now and will continue to increase into the future.
Yeah. It's interesting that you note the sense of isolation that you were feeling, and that's something that I also feel. I have a lot of friends who are very caring and very concerned and compassionate, but the moment that this conversation comes up, usually by me, I heard this story, I have to share it because it's so alive in me. A lot of people shut down. And I think a lot of people are used to that when they have these concerns, whenever they bring it to their family, to be kind of disregarded, or, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but I think a lot of people just don't have the tools to handle it themselves. So I feel like the response is to kind of numb. And then whenever anybody brings it to us, there's like an agitation that kind of comes with that of like, oh, we all know, but just don't talk about it, you know?
Yeah, this culture is really programmed to seek out like um, pleasure and happy things. And like I'm thinking about this meme that's so popular about like no bad vibes. Like we see that everywhere, like no good vibes only, no bad vibes. And this really has us turning away from feelings like fear and grief. And so when we're encountered with something that might potentially evoke those feelings and we maybe don't know how to sit with them, then of course we employ a bunch of our survival mechanisms or our coping tools that help us not actually feel those distressing feelings. And what we're being called to do is actually build our distress tolerance and figure out ways to be with things that scare us or uncertainty or things that fill us with grief instead of running away from it or avoiding it or pretending it's not there. How do we actually like dig into it and process it and see what's on the other side?
Yeah. Yeah, how do you kind of make that sale to people? Like for people who have spent their whole life kind of numbing themselves to it and who are living pretty decent lives, who maybe haven't felt the immediate effects of it like some other places in the world, how do you encourage people to dig into this work and to see what's on the other side if they're not feeling the pressure yet?
Therein lies the problem, right, Brett?
Yeah.
we,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
can't make people see things they're not ready to see yet. And so I think with what we do at Good Grief Network, there's a lot of people who are willing to see and who are willing to lean in. And for those folks who aren't ready to see yet, and which ends up being a pretty privileged space to be in, like if you can still afford food and your mortgage payment and you've not been hit by a climate disaster, you've not been deeply impacted by one of the many social injustices that these systems rain down on us. I think it's only a matter of time, and we connect with those folks who stay disconnected by expressing our values, by reminding folks what we care about. And I think most importantly is remembering that we're all human beings trying to have a human experience in a deeply traumatizing culture, and like never losing sight of that. I think that's where the polarization continues to grow, is we get angry because people aren't seeing things the way that we see them, because we're so entrenched in our viewpoints that we forget that we're actually human beings. And most of the adverse reactions that we're having are probably due to stress responses or trauma responses, or at the very least some sort of scarcity mindset of like, I have to survive, so I have to do this, or I believe this because it directly confronts my capacity to live and be successful in this world.
Yeah. One of the theories that I have as somebody, I'm a body worker by trade, so I'm working very intimately with people's nervous systems. And something I think is like, I think that this eco distress is affecting everybody in an equal manner, but I think we have different degrees of sensitivity to understanding it or being able to access, like, oh, this is affecting me. And I think even the people that are totally trying to numb out to it and are like climate change is a hoax, I think on a very subtle physiological level, like our human bodies are logging that like things are different. Things are like subtly, it's just not what it's been like. Do you think that that's possible, or do you think that people can totally disconnect from the reality of the environment that they're in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I I think it's the former. I think it's what you first said, in that we're all deeply interconnected. And of course, we're going to be impacted when our air, our clean water, our clean food are no longer accessible. But I think that some of us can numb out a little bit more or desensitize. Like, we live in such a fast paced culture that is phobic of emotions that it is easier often to stay disconnected than to actually feel what's going on. And as soon as we have an entry point into that feeling, and for a lot of us it's different, sometimes it's a personal grief or a personal loss that launches us into recognizing the collective state. But when we start to feel that, it's so overwhelming to our nervous system that then we employ those feelings that you're talking about, or those strategies that you're talking about, the avoidance or the numbing out, or sometimes it just looks like a reinvestment in the culture, because you're like, well, if that's not working and that's really scary, then why don't I just go and buy something, or watch this other show in Netflix, because the alternative is to feel bad, and we don't want to feel bad. We don't have the tools to help us when we feel bad work through that. And one of the most fundamental tools is community and communal support, like especially when we're talking about grief is an incredibly communal feeling, emotion, experience. And since this dominant culture has taught us to privatize our pain, we're like at odds with how to even grieve and how to move through some of these feelings.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, as we're beginning this process of connecting with our feelings, and if somebody's making the choice, like, I want to thaw out all of this frozen emotion regarding this, what are some of the qualities of a healthy container that one should look for when they start this process? I know you just said community was one of them, but is there, in like the physical space that you're in and the people that you're relating with, how would you describe a healthy container?
We definitely have to have elements of authenticity, which allows for vulnerability. Like, we're all seeking to have an experience of being seen and being witnessed, and having that container be strong enough to hold us, but we can't have that without trust. So I'm using words like authenticity, vulnerability, and trust. All of those components have to be a part of whatever's going to hold us to be open enough to actually feel the feelings that we're doing, or feelings that we're experiencing, to be able to process them. But because we live in a world that does want to keep our pain private, does want to say our suffering should be solo, we also have to break down the barriers of what it's like to be seen. It's such a vulnerable experience to actually be in our grief, to cry in front of somebody else. And so, how do we start practicing? We don't have to go from 0 to 10 right away, but certainly we have to figure out ways to show up more authentically. And that in itself is countercultural, which
Yeah.
also means that the receivers, the other people in the community, have to be deeply skilled in learning how to listen And there's a phrase we use a lot in Good Grief Network. We say, be with, don't fix. And that's not
Mm-hmm.
something that we come really trained into with this culture. We actually are a culture of fixing, of rushing to solutions. And so the container also has to have elements of generative tension, of being able to be with this like uncomfortable feeling without rushing through it. Like, how can I be with your grief without telling you, read this book, or um, you know do this exercise or do this other thing? If we're not able to actually be with other people's pain, then we might actually cause more pain to the person who's trying to find some connection and solace.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. So, would you advocate for people who are looking for a space to start processing this? Is there anything that they should be doing before they connect to a space to be able to be more resilient for other people's emotions? Is there like a practice that you would suggest they employ to kind of strengthen their inner resolve before they come in and then don't know how to really be in community?
Well, I think all of it's a practice. I think that's important to note, is like we're never really getting it right. Like, especially for those of us like me, I come from a tremendous amount of trauma. I was really disconnected from my feelings, and I was really disconnected from being able to process. And the skills that I am learning is, one, how to be with my own uncomfortable feelings. Because if I can be with my own discomfort, if I can recognize when in a state of grief or fear, then I can be better equipped to handle that when somebody I love or a community member or somebody that I'm around is experiencing those feelings. But if I'm suppressing those feelings within myself, if I don't know how to be with my own feelings of agitation, or uh, yeah, if I don't know how to be with myself, I certainly can't be with other folks. And so I think that's a great entry point. And for those of us who who live in deeply traumatized bodies, that's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of courage, and oftentimes takes the experience of being with somebody else who's a healer. Because we have these defense mechanisms that keep us safe. There's a reason that those of us who live in traumatized bodies have trouble trusting and have trouble connecting. And it's because those connections have been severed. It's because our trust has been tested time and time again. And so a lot of this thawing is trusting ourselves enough to know that we can be with these really overwhelming feelings without getting stuck in them. And oftentimes that requires community or additional healing to help.
Yeah. Yeah, it speaks to me of this idea of like mirror neurons. I
Yes.
don't know if this is an important part of having a solid container is just like having people at different levels of resiliency so that there's different levels of resourcefulness. So some can hold the space while others are going through their grief, but then still allowing space for people who maybe are less resilient to have an opportunity to learn what that looks like in that space. Because sometimes we need somebody else to be holding a space for us to really meet ourselves more fully and without
Yeah.
getting lost in it. So that idea of
Yeah.
connecting with healers, connecting with other people who've been doing this work, I think is it's so important. It's interwoven with the path.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads me to one of the big things, your big pilot program, if you will, for the Good Grief Network, of your 10-step program for helping people develop that resilience and that sense of literacy and how to navigate these times. This is really the thing that has struck with chord with me, and something that I've been looking over every day in preparation of this and just contemplating. I think it's a brilliant model. So I want to let
Thank you.
you kind of describe that a little bit, and maybe we can jump into some of those.
In my graduate studies, I was grateful enough and had enough time and space to investigate what other folks were doing to build personal resilience and collective resilience, because it turns out you cannot have personal resilience if you don't actually have the support of community. So, one of the key components of personal resilience is community resilience. But I had enough time and space to interview people, to dig into the literature, to harken back to thousands of years of ancient wisdom to see what helps people be resilient. And the map of the 10 steps is that it's the amalgamation of all the information that I've received in this life. And also, my wife has helped inform the 10 steps tremendously, but also we learn something from everybody we sit with. And so, the iteration of the 10 steps as it stands now has really been a community project over the last 8 years to be in its current formation. But like other step modalities, we work one step a week, but it doesn't have to be so. You could work one step a month. You could use them as themes. They're not particularly linear, although they do kind of follow an arc. And the goal of the step program is to really do this internal assessment. It's to get real about the things we can't control, to figure out the stories we're telling ourselves, which are biases or cultural stories or the trauma stories that we're living in, and then kind of turn this self assessment and the self work externally. But before we go back out into the external world, we're figuring out more about our intentions. We're learning how to set boundaries. We're learning how to take breaks and rest, and to really come face to face with our complicity in these systems. Because a lot of times, those of us who want to be change makers can get really bogged down by feelings of shame or guilt by being components of this system. And so it's a lot about this internal work, this mindfulness practice of being really present with what's here, but also our place in what's unfolding, and then moving externally into meaningful action. And we wait until the 10th step to start figuring out our meaningful actions. And we really want to broaden the definition here. We really want to say, where do your experiences and your skills and your passions intersect? Because that's going to probably be different for a lot of us. And then how do you use that sort of passion point or that superpower in service of healing, growth, and connection? And that really allows us to regain some sense of agency in a time when a lot of us feel like we don't have a lot of agency. These systems are so big, the problems are so big. But what if we could actually say meaningful actions are like growing a garden and providing surplus food to our neighbors, or like reinvesting in parenting so we're not projecting all of our fears and insecurities about the state of the world or the future world onto our kids? Instead, we can really be with them and their big emotions. What if it is, hosting a grieving circle for your community once a month so we can learn that those techniques of trusting and authenticity and being witnessed in our griefs, like it doesn't just have to be about voting with our dollar or signing a petition or showing up. Those things are important. They're holding actions. They prevent more harm being done to the world. But there are also things that need to be done that have to deal with returning our souls back and learning how to connect and build trust and attend to our nervous system. Those things are meaningful as well.
Yeah. I really like that emphasis because I think a lot of people, when they begin, I think one of the big barriers to doing this kind of work is the fact that a lot of people like aren't activists. They might not have a direct, immediate relationship with a lot of these systems. They could be like a nurse or they could be a shop clerk or something like that. So a lot of people like, I'm not even going to begin because there's nothing that I can do. But it sounds to me like what you're saying is that wherever you are in life, you have an access point to create a change, even if it's just on the micro level, which really does have bigger implications. Because if we're all taking these steps, then we're emanating that kind of change, and it inspires other people.
Yeah. Well, and if we can switch from being so reactive to being responsive, that those ripples travel into our families, it travels into our coworkers, it travels into our communities, and then larger and larger. But for many of us, because we're stuck in this toxic culture that causes so much trauma, we're in a state of reactivity. Where our nervous systems are coding so many things as threats. Like,
Yeah.
we're in a defensive position, we're in a protective posture quite a lot. And if we can start figuring out places, pockets of relative safety, our nervous systems can start talking to each other and saying, like, hey, you're actually safe right now. I got your back. You don't have to have this figured out. If
Yeah.
flooding impacts your community, I got you. If a fire comes through your community, I got you. If you can't afford rent, I got you. Instead, everybody's having this very isolating experience, thinking our survival, I mean, probably indirectly thinking our survival's on the line, but with all these reports coming out, with all these impacts directly happening, of course, it's becoming more conscious, more available, more aware in our minds and our bodies. But the idea here is that our own inner work, our own work to figure out where our nervous system state is and how we react and what our trauma responses are. That's not just personal work, that's family work, that's community work.
Yeah,
That is what we need to do to create a better world, is have this acute awareness of who we are, how we move through this world, and how our emotions shape our reality and our relationships.
I love it. I couldn't agree more. You know, I know this might be a little on the nose, but how would you describe the difference between reaction and responsiveness? That might not be so obvious to some people.
We work on this a lot in our facilitation training, but a reaction tends to be a patterned response. Uh, a response without taking a moment to think or to pause. And what we try to teach our facilitators is actually to start practicing pauses throughout your day so that you can be a bit more mindful of how you're engaging with the world around you. So I think a lot of when my nervous system is really ramped up and my dog is barking at the FedEx truck, my response is to be really short and to, holler at him like, stop, stop. But if I can pause and I can see that he's actually really terrified of that FedEx truck, it gives me a moment to come back to him and to have like a softer correction that's not just, demanding that he stop doing those things. I think, or parenting might be another good example. The reaction versus responding is that moment that you have taken to be aware of your options and how you're going to respond and being able to select the response. A reaction is just like out of the gate, nervous system not calm at all, trying to sort of end that threat or solve something. It's more immediate. A response is more mindful, more intentional.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea that like a reaction is kind of a recapitulation of energy that's already existed that you've maybe been conditioned with. And again, I think a lot of us are beings of having trauma. So a lot of the times we respond or react out of that kind of traumatic,
Yes.
heightened nervous system activation. And this idea of coming from a place of pause, there's a space. And I think that that space is where a lot of creativity and fresh vital energy kind of comes through. And it reminds me, I have a meditation teacher by the name of Ethan Nichtern, and I recently took a little class with him where we were talking about the bardos, which is the space in between life and death. And he shared this practice with us called the pause practice. And it was a great way to like train that kind of pausing muscle. And because it's one thing to like say to do that when things are really heightened, when your nervous system's really activated. And what he was saying is, like right before you go to do the dishes, just pause, just stop, kind of just don't do anything for like 10 seconds. When you get into your car before you turn it on, just pause. And the more that we can kind of get in the habit of that, the more available that's going to be to us when we actually are in a heightened space. It's more conditioned, and then we can operate from creativity rather than just the pain of the past.
Yeah, and if we're not practiced in pausing, it's actually incredibly hard. And 10 seconds can feel like a lifetime. And the the speed of the culture reinforces frenzy, it reinforces reactivity, it reinforces go to the next thing, get more done, do the next thing, what else is on your to-do list. The pause is actually incredibly countercultural because it allows you to regain a sense of presence in your everyday life. One of my teachers suggested pausing every time you go through like the door frame of a room. And I've not been able to do that because I'm like, I have to like write emails, I gotta I gotta get this
Yeah.
stuff done. But like what if we could actually spend more time being aware of where our attention is and where our nervous system is and how we're moving through the world instead of just on this sort of autopilot of like get things done, what's the next thing, gotta do this, gotta drop the kids off here, gotta do this.
Yeah. It's amazing because, I practice mindfulness and have for a bit. And there are moments when I feel like I'm just very present, very disconnected with my body and my mind and my speech. And it's in those moments where I'm like, nothing is more important than being present. And then I just forget it. I'm like, yeah, but
Yeah.
what's also important is watching this YouTube video.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how, even as practiced as I am, it's still so easy to fall into that speedy distractibility and then just be living life for weeks like that. Then I
Yeah.
contact the presence again. I'm like, oh no, what have I done?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also really important to name that the more we're caught up in this frenzy lifestyle, the more that we're trying to keep up with the speed of the culture, which is a very unnatural speed, the harder it is to get back into presence because there's probably a lot of feelings that you've not felt. There's probably a lot of things happening in your mind body that are uncomfortable to you. And so I think especially again I'm coming from my own personal experience, but in my traumatized body when I tend to slow down, it's like, "Oh, that's quite uncomfortable. So why not go back to that YouTube clip? Why not do these sorts of things?" It's a sustained practice in this feeling of being relatively safe enough to unpack those feelings when they come back in, when I can etch out the time and space to be still, to notice what's going on in my internal world. And if you don't have the tools, if you don't have the support to do it, it's quite terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. It strikes again that idea of like the microcosm being the macrocosm. I can't help but feel that this kind of thing that you just described of being so fast and frenzied to avoid pain, it's the exact thing that's causing the climate crisis that we're in. It's the entire society is
Yes.
operating on that way. So I really am resonating with that sense of like doing this work on yourself is going to help you have the tools to respond in a more national, global way because you'll at least understand the energies within yourself. And until you're able to do that, it's going to be really hard to respond to the global sickness because you're still there in it too.
Well, and imagine that you're writing climate policy for, either the local or the state or the national, international level, and you're writing the climate policy from a state of frenzy instead of a state of
Yeah.
pause. The things you're going to create in that state of frenzy are much different than the things that you create from the state of pause. We can look at polyvagal theory. We literally live in different stories all the time, and it depends what state our nervous system is in what story actually gets like written down on paper and transcribed. And I think
Yeah.
this is the biggest call to transformation is at the subtle level. It's at the level of noticing, of slowing down, because that's where actually everything is made. That's where our relationships are cultivated. That's where our policies are written. That's how our food's made. Like
Yeah.
everything starts at the small and ripples back out. And it's the fractal pattern, it's emergence.
Yeah. Yeah. So, to kind of go back a little bit to the 10-step program itself, one of the things that I was really struck by was the very first one, the thing that people are going to read the moment they put their eyes on it is kind of one of the most difficult ones, to acknowledge the severity. Um, so I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts of why that's the one that you started with, because it almost seems like the most overwhelming.
It is both one of the hardest steps and can be really overwhelming. And my wife wrote in the book about how she's always coming back to step one. Like, why am I here again? I thought I got past this. Uh, we start the program in this way because if we don't have a shared understanding of the state of the world, it's really hard to move through as a community to the rest of the steps. We need like a base layer of agreement that things are incredibly wrong, these systems are unjust, and no one's coming to save us. So, where do you go from there? One of the quotes we or use often is from Trebbie Johnson. She wrote a book called Radical Joy for Hard Times. She also founded a nonprofit by that same name. And to paraphrase her quote, she doesn't say accept, or she says, acceptance doesn't mean resignation. Acceptance means that we're finally open to all the creative solutions before us. Unless we have a shared understanding of that baseline that things are bad, they're getting worse, and we're under equipped to deal with this as a culture, as a society, as a global humanity, then we can't go anywhere else. We have to really, I guess, root or ground in the reality. And that's not to say we need to all agree how bad things are or that there's no hope or that there is hope and we're one techno fix away from solving it. We just need to have that grounded reality that things are bad. No one's coming to save us. We need to figure out what we're going to do as individuals and collectives to face these hard realities.
Yeah. I feel like there's, in people's kind of yoking of that step, going to be different levels of acknowledgement, and how they, in terms of like effectiveness, because I'm sure some people could really spend some time looking at every little thing that is wrong and really contacting a very deep sense of severity. And, how much would you recommend people kind of to take that in? Is there maybe like too much to where it ends up overwhelming? And is there any benefit of overwhelm, to like, oh, I'm really, really feeling the whole thing, or is it like something you want to like titrate maybe?
Yes, titrate is a great invitation for something like this. And I think it goes back to what I was saying about the co founder of Good Grief Network, Amy Lewis Rowe, and my wife, coming back to the step over and over again. I think what happens for many of us is even if we're really sort of well versed, well studied in the predicament, it's like another unlayering or another unmasking of the intricacy of the gridlockiness of the systems, like they're so complex and it's so multi-layered that I feel like we can spend a whole lifetime in deep analysis of the things that are wrong, and it's still an unveiling process of like, oh, and then this, oh, and then this, oh, and this corporation owns this media source and this, and like we could spend all day every day looking at how interlaced, interlocked these problems are. But I think what is more important is the skill of titrating, which is taking on a little bit, resourcing yourself, taking in a little bit, resourcing yourself. But that also begs the question of, do you know how to resource yourself? Has anyone taught you or sat down with you and said, this is how you identify your resources? These are the things that help you restore a sense of okayness so that when you get activated, when you feel unsafe, if you really are safe, you use these resources to come back into the present moment. I'm here. I'm sitting at my table. I have my cup of coffee. My dog's next to me. I'm here. I'm present. I'm safe. And then you can get back into the material. If we're constantly overwhelming our nervous system, we are in danger of leaving our window of tolerance, getting escalated into hyper arousal or hypo arousal. And then this is where the sort of angry responses come in. This is where the dissociation responses come in. Like
Yeah.
it's a practice of taking information in, and this practice is also countercultural because we have a 24/7 news cycle that is constantly
Yeah.
telling us that there's crisis everywhere and that we're all going to die tomorrow of cancer or war or famine or whatever it is that the news is telling us this particular day. And so part of it is doing that unplugging and that resourcing.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to speak for you, but it kind of sounds like you're saying maybe learn some skills to resource before you actually start engaging with this work. And I think even our baseline before we start kind of taking this material in, I think everybody on each side of the political spectrum has a sense something's wrong, whether it's the climate, whether it's politics, war, and I think that there's a lot of right material to use in the practice of learning how to resource ourselves before you even begin the taking on this other energy.
Yeah, well, and in an ideal world, because there's so many of us who are already inundated by the state of the world or the predicament or aspects of the predicament, but in an ideal world, once we've been exposed to that material, how can we then go resource ourselves, right? Because sometimes we've already taken on too much and our nervous system is already completely overwhelmed. And that could be where we just completely unplug. That could be why we don't want to talk about it when our friends bring it up at dinner, is like we know about it and we don't feel like there's anything we can do about it. And we are not resourced enough to handle this. And so it's easier to look away, or it's easier to talk about the plans for doing what we're doing tomorrow instead of actually confronting these hard realities. And so how do we, as teachers in grade schools or college professors who are teaching some of these things, how do we start helping teachers prepare students to have these resources and to be able to identify them? What we've really done in our schools is divorce emotional education or emotional intelligence from like learning the facts. And I think we should marry those things back together so that as we continue to be overwhelmed by the content, oh no, it says my internet's cutting out. Are you still there? I cut out, I think. I'm sorry about
Yeah.
that.
No, it's okay. I think we both did.
Oh, okay.
The last thing that I
I,
heard was that schools have kind of divorced emotional education, intelligence, and then that's when you cut out.
Yeah, well, I propose putting them back together, like being emotionally intelligent about how we present the facts and allowing students, very young students, to understand what resources are and that they have resources available to them as they're learning the hard facts, so that as we grow up and as we're inundated by the news cycles, as we're inundated by the state of the world and these conflicts overseas, or, the next mudslide or the next flood, whatever it may be, we've been practicing resourcing ourselves from a young age. I think that's really missing in the grade schools, particularly the public grade schools.
Yeah. So I think we've talked a little bit about maybe the methods of resourcing ourselves in terms of like the pause and finding community. Is there anything that you do in particular that helps you stay resourced when you hear a story that's like, oh, really? This is okay. This is our reality now. What's your like immediate go to for that?
Yeah, that's such a good question because I think what I do, which I'm not advocating for, is I compartmentalize a lot throughout my day. And
Mm,
then usually after I unplug, because I'm still very much embedded in this capitalistic system, like I still have to pay my rent. I have to make sure I make enough money. I have to make sure that I complete things so that Good Grief Network stays up and running. And so I compartmentalize. And then toward the end of my day, I try to factor in some time for stillness and like kind of look around in my body and say, is there anything that I was kind of supposed to feel throughout the day that I suppressed or just ignored? Like, now's the time to feel it. Now is the time. And so I call the practice letting my feelings catch up with me, because I'm
yeah.
still learning to have a relationship with them. But because I'm so good at compartmentalizing, I actively need to create some space to let them catch up with me. And it's hard. It's hard when you're watching the news come out of Palestine. It's hard when you're, you know, noticing that food prices are skyrocketing. It's hard when you notice that a new wildfire has started in those places. It's so much easier to read the headline and be like, yep, I'll handle that later. I'll handle that
Yeah.
later. But the actual
Yeah.
practice of feeling those things is incredibly hard. And yet we have to do it. We're being asked to feel the grief and the fear and the rage over and over again. But with this practice, then we come to recognize what grief feels like in our bodies. We come to recognize what fear feels like. And instead of wanting to run from it, which was my previous technique, was like shut down, run, avoid, distract. Then I'm like, grief's here again. Okay. Like maybe I need to cry. Maybe I need to go for a run. Maybe I need to go spend some time with my dog and throw the ball for a little while. Like when we become acquainted with how these feelings actually feel in our body, we're less afraid of them. And then we know that they're not going to stay around forever. And we need to maybe do something to dispel that energy.
Yeah. Yeah. This makes me feel like, as our society, we don't really have like a value for grief, and I think that that's why we tend to avoid it because we don't see it as the teacher that it is. And I know that's kind of like a trite thing to say, but really, I think it's these energies of really navigating fear, grief, upset. I think it's when we feel and allow these energies to move through our bodies, it allows us to really show up for people in a different way, and it helps us to feel connected. And I think like a big part of connection is learning how to allow these things. And to me, that's like one of the biggest boons of being alive. It's the ability to able to share space with people. And I think that these really are the things that help us develop compassion and step outside of our self identity, like self cherishing. And I really think that that's really where like some of the sweetest nectar of life is when we're able to truly be present with other people. And it's just wild that it's through these difficult hallways of grief and pain and hurt, but it's essential compost for living a full human life.
Yeah, Brene Brown teaches that we can't selectively numb our feelings, right? So the more that we avoid feelings like grief or some of these more unpleasant ones, the more we also mute our experiences of like joy and love and like our rich sense of aliveness that we're all seeking for. And so it's like this paradox where, like, if you actually want to feel intimately connected, you have to feel things like grief to remain fully balanced and alive. You can't just feel all the good things without feeling all the things you don't want to feel. It's a both and practice. I was also
Yeah.
thinking that Francis Weller, who is a self-described soul activist, but he's also a therapist and a grief worker. He trains a lot of people on how to be with collective grief. He talks a lot about how actually feeling these really heavy and painful feelings help us mature as individuals, and that we have a real lack of elders in our culture because we haven't learned how to be in healthy relationship with things like grief and fear and rage and helplessness. Like, what sort of people do we become by learning that we can tolerate and grow from these painful experiences?
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that point of our lack of elders in this society. I think that if you're lucky, you can find one, but we really don't have we don't have a space for people as they age to become that role. We don't really have that many role models these days. And I think that that really is one of the key things of other cultures is that a lot of them still maintain a sense of reverence and respect for the people who have made it to there, and they respect their accumulation of wisdom. And we really don't have any respect for wisdom. I
Yeah.
think like when you look at our idols, a lot of people idolize Donald Trump, and it's like this is these are the people that we put on pedestals. We
Yeah.
don't have much alternative.
I also think that this comes down to a fear of death and of aging. This
Yeah.
culture also sends us messages very early on that we're not supposed to be animals, that we're human beings, and that we can somehow, ward off death if we apply the right cream, if we buy this thing, if we do this thing. And we don't have a healthy understanding that death is part of the life cycle. And so instead of having folks mature in age and then understand that toward the end of their life that death is a natural normal part of the life cycle, we spend a lot of spiritual, psychic, and emotional energy warding off death and pretending it's never coming for us. But what if we could actually embrace death as a teacher? What if we could embrace the fact that the finitude of our lives are actually what bring meaning and a lot more joy, because you don't know if you're promised tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the other things I liked about your 10-step program was the acknowledgement of acknowledging our mortality, and not as our mortality, but everything's mortality. And I think that that's one of the big blockages to doing this work and really addressing not just or climate change, but also like the ecological devastation of our biomes. And I think people just take for granted that things will always be as they are and have been. But we're
Yeah.
already seeing just such mass amounts of extinction that's happening, and I think really acknowledging like, no, everything could go away, and that's very possible.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
very
and
sobering.
it very sobering and such a hard potential to sit with. Like, of course, we want to escape from that. That's a really hard and painful thought. Like, everyone we know and love is going to fall away at some point. Like, that is crushing. But also, doesn't that make every moment sweeter that we get to be with our beloved, or that we get to be with the natural world? I think this step, which is honor my mortality and the mortality of all, it brings in a lot of tension, because while death is natural and normal and part of the life cycle and needs to be honored as such, we are also seeing tremendous injustices with regard to the way we treat people and premature death, and also the way that we treat ecosystems and premature death with species extinction. And so, it's to understand death is to have a complicated nature or complicated relationship with it. How do we see it as a teacher, but also hold the tension of injustice and the fact that this dominant culture is really speeding through life, or is uh, carving up life and livelihoods, and is just like anti-life to the biggest extent. Like, we've made a system that prioritizes capital and money at the expense of life. And so there is an element of unjust death, and there is an element of like, this is unacceptable. Why are we creating systems that are so anti-life? And maybe it's because of our fear of death. Maybe we cause so much death because we're trying to avoid death, we're trying to play God.
Yeah. I think that's what drives a lot of the pursuit of power. Once somebody gets enough money to live uh, comfortably forever, like what is it that's motivating them? And I do think that there is this sense of like leaving one's mark on the world. I think that that drives a lot of people, someone like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. They want to become something much bigger than what being a human is. But ultimately, even if their legacy lasts 50 years or after their death, like they will be forgotten, and like that's something that we all have to kind of acknowledge. And really, like, our legacy is like I know this is so hallmark, but it's like the people that we touch. Like, that's where, in my opinion of reincarnation, it's the energy that you put out is what's getting repurposed. So it's like, can we create systems that promote life? And I think that's the goal. I think we've just kind of missed that.
Yeah, yeah. Ernest Becker, who was, I believe, a sociologist, coined the term death anxiety. And a bunch
Mm-hmm.
of researchers have created a theory to study it. It's called terror management theory. And the premise is that from a young age, we know we're going to die. And that is so much for our psyche that it ends up doing a lot of things if we don't bring it to our conscious awareness. And so the type of legacy is scraping for being remembered, is for leaving that mark. Maybe you want to write the best novel, or maybe you spray paint a bridge. You want somebody to know that you existed and that your life mattered. And then at a different level, this ends up manifesting in cultural worldviews. So if you know you're going to die, maybe you adhere to a culture that you think is really strong and powerful, so that you get to be part of the legacy of that culture, and that's how you live on. And so I think the idea of terror management theory, or more generally death anxiety, can also be mapped onto what's happening with polarization. What's
Yeah.
happening with our capacity to other. Like, if the more powerful we feel, the more we get to live, whether that's directly or indirectly. And we could talk at length about death anxiety or terror management theory, but it just is such a fascinating lens to put on, and to see the current political state and the current sense of othering that's happening, increasingly so.
Yeah. There's so many paths that I could take this conversation because all of that is so interesting. But there is something I think is really important, especially as we're in an election year. You mentioned this process of othering and everything becoming polarized. How do you feel doing this kind of work and knowing that there are going to be people who don't spend any time with it, but immediately peg you as, like, oh, they're just leftist and they got all this, they're trying to convert people and just to turn what you're doing, this deeply thought out work, into a political statement. How do you navigate that? And have you had any interactions with people like that?
Honestly, not too many yet. We have had a couple of them. And I think what's important to keep in mind about what we're doing with Good Grief Network, even though it's kind of termed as eco distress work or climate grief work, like, what we're really trying to do is create a map for being fully alive in times of crises. And that is important for anyone. Like, any of us, all of us are just trying to have an experience of, like, getting through this life with a little bit of love and a little bit of joy and a little bit of pleasure. And most of us don't want to be doing harm. And I think that is a relatable enough notion. Like, you said earlier in our conversation, like, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, you can sense something's wrong. It's just that we fall in different political divides, thinking of different solutions to get us out of that wrongness. Like, we feel a trembling of disconnection. We feel these feelings of isolation. We want to be safe. We want our families to be safe. All those things are very human slash animal experiences. And yet we just have different ways of going about them. And so, instead of thinking that this is a super lefty program, like, why aren't we just trying to actually be alive while we're alive? Like, that's the question we're trying to answer, is how do you not numb out in a time of so much pain?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. It's a great question. It's a great, I mean, it's kind of what my platform is too, as well. Um, yeah. So, I do want to create a little bit of space for you to talk about your book as well, How to Live in a Chaotic Climate. How does that relate to the Good Grief Network and this 10-step program? And why did you feel like you needed to turn this into a book? And how does that differ? And yeah, if you could just kind of go into that a little bit.
The 10-step program that we run through Good Grief Network is a lot about practice. It's a lot about deep listening and bearing witness and sharing parts of our stories and building resilience and connections. But the book provides an avenue because it's actually mapped onto the 10-step program. So each of the chapters are one of the steps. And the book allowed us a framework to tell you why we've created it in such a way. What's the philosophy behind why we have the steps a certain way? And then Amy and I, the co author and co founder of Good Grief Network, we put stories about how we're having a very human experience at this time as well. So it's like we call it a little bit of a like a step war, like memoir, but
Love
with the
that.
steps.
Yeah, yeah,
And so you get to see us like struggling to be human and to show up, and we have quirks and we have issues that we're trying to grow through, but it's also an invitation to understand why we should feel our feelings, why we need to do trauma work, why showing up is important. And so doing both in tandem or together, you get a chance to be heard and seen in the actual practice of the 10-step program, but the book provides a framework for you to really deep into the hard realities of this moment, but provide a pathway or some sort of companionship uh, as you go through the journey.
yeah. I like the personal twist that you're putting on it by including your stories. I think that going back to the beginning of this conversation with like mirror neurons and all of that, to be able to really just be an example on how being vulnerable and authentic looks and feels, I think is really one of the biggest teachings that we could be sharing with people. Is not that we got it under control, but if you could just present in a way of like, it's messy and I feel messy sometimes, but this is what it looks like. It's not going to be perfect, and it's okay that it's not perfect. So I really appreciate that as being an element.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Brett. I think it's also important to remember because what happens is we have these hero figures in our lives and in our culture. And then what happens is we feel too small to ever reach sort of hero status. So, like, why do we even try to be innovative? Why do we try to be idealists? And I think what we need to do is remember that all of us are human beings having a human experience and just trying to make it through. Like, the more we can normalize that none of us are actually heroes and we're all just ordinary people, and some of us have ideas that we share on podcasts, and some of us are like trying really hard to be good parents, but we need to normalize that it's okay to be a human being, and you don't have to be somebody extraordinary to try to show up with courage and try to do the right thing and try to assess your values. I think we need to figure out how to rehumanize us as entities, even if we have a little bit of a platform. Like, we're still just human beings,
Yeah,
we're still trying to eat and take care of ourselves and play and
yeah,
just be people.
yeah, yeah. I've really liked this year. I've really kind of turned my back on like the idea of the hero myth. The Joseph Campbellian
Yeah,
notion, and it's one that's like kind of guided me throughout a lot of my life. But I'm reading through the Dune series, and like that whole thing is a treatise on like maybe we shouldn't ever have heroes, and just that idea of just really being ordinary. Like
yeah,
ordinariness is such a special quality to have. And if somebody can be truly ordinary, there's something extraordinary about it,
yeah,
but learning how to appreciate that and stop this participating in a culture of personality of trying to be somebody. And I think that is another big element of how we move forward, because once you set that aside, then you have so much more space for others. And and it's until we start learning how to do that that I think our actions will be a little stifled until then.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that sense of competitiveness, right? Like, if you're a hero, you always have to be creating new content and you have to be
Mhm.
figuring things out and you have to be thinking and doing things no one's ever done before. But, like, those aren't the solutions we're going for. The solutions we're going for, again, are at the subtle level. It's about reconnecting, it's about relationality. And all those things are actually incredibly ordinary tasks and ordinary invitations for us to be engaging in these times. All of us
Yeah.
can do those. Like, the revolution is accessible, it's not inaccessible, and we need to remind people about that.
Wow, that is a great tagline. And there's something that's even very like old age about it. Like it's not like a new age, fresh thing. Like returning back to community is something that's in our like ancestral roots. So it's like the pathway towards that has already been laid, and we have it pretty well articulated and mapped out. So it's like you don't have to make anything new to do that.
Yeah. Well, and then there's a lot of undoing that we have to
Hmm.
do to build community. And like, I think part of the addiction and part of the access culture that we have, like in excess, like too much binge watching TV, too much sex, too much drinking or drugs or whatever, is because we're feeling the lack of community and we don't actually know how to get back to it. We're feeling like this hole in our spirits of where community used to fill that, and instead we're trying to grasp after things like money and all these vices to fill those holes. And as soon as we realize that that's actually an empty pursuit, and community is what really helps us feel connected and whole and joy, then that path, I think, illuminates. But we have to come to the realization of like this empty pursuit of vices is actually really tearing up our souls and our spirits, and we need to do something else.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that feels like a really good place to kind of end on, especially because you have communities that you've created that people can plug into. So I want to leave a little bit of time for you to kind of just share how people can continue this work or start this work, and how they can interact with you going forward.
Yeah, thank you. The first thing that we can mention is that over at Good Grief Network, we do a few different projects or programs that you can get connected with. One is our 10-step program, and we had paused over the summer for a little bit, but we'll be bringing it back digitally in the fall. And so folks can check that out, and hopefully we'll have a few different times so that people around the world can join us. And that would be where we work one step a week and for 10 weeks at a time. And people kind of gruff at 10 weeks, it's a long time. But also, if we're doing this subtle change, if we're doing this internal investigation before turning outward, you actually need to create the time and the space to be able to allow transformation to happen. Like, we can't just show up one time and be like, well, we're different now, my nervous
Yeah.
system is okay, I feel
Yeah.
connected. And then the second opportunity that's really big for us right now is we're training facilitators to hold peer support spaces. We're recognizing that we're coming into a mental health crisis that's already been going, especially with COVID, and is just going to continue to be present with us. And so, how do we learn how to support each other through these times? And we train facilitators to hold peer support spaces so they can bring it to their book clubs or their church groups or their their sort of groups that are already existing or that they want to create, and be able to have these hard conversations in person with the people that we love, and the people that we want to be connecting with in our communities.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. And your book, where
Yeah.
can people find the book?
The book is available through ebook and audiobook and any bookstore, particularly online as well. And it's just How to Live in a Chaotic Climate: 10 Steps to Reconnect with Ourselves, our communities, and our planet. And yeah, hopefully it's a really helpful companion. Even if you don't participate in the live 10-step program, it can be a really good resource for your journey, for kind of orienting to these hard truths, and hopefully helping you identify some resources to stay in the game, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Is there any outlet that you think is maybe the best one to support you directly? Like, is it Amazon, or is it like where would you recommend people go if they were to order it?
If you're in the United States, you can go to Bookshop, and we have like a little link, or maybe you could put it in the show notes. But
Hmm.
we have a little bookshop through bookshop.org, and then they
Okay.
donate a little bit of the proceeds back to Good Grief Network directly. So that's kind of a cool way to avoid things like Amazon and,
Yeah.
like giving back to the community.
Love it. Cool.
Yeah,
Okay, so yeah, that was it for today. I want to say thank you so much, Laura. This has been very informative and it went by really fast.
it
So,
did.
yeah, I really
Yeah.
appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll have you on sometime soon,
Yeah. Thanks for the questions, Brett. I really appreciate it.
of course. All right, that was the episode. Thank you so much for listening all the way through until the end. I really do make this show for you. That was LaUra Schmidt. You can keep up with them over at thegoodgriefnetwork.org. There's also going to be links to their book down in the description below. If you want to support this show, head on over to patreon.com/21st Century Vitalism and consider becoming a patron. If not, you can always just head on over to YouTube, subscribe to stay updated on all the new episodes. You can follow us on Instagram. I've been doing some writing stuff out there. Or like us on Facebook, which I use the least because I think it's kind of a dying platform. Beyond that, though, anything and everything is seen, felt, and received. So thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. We'll catch you next week.